Welcome to a talk on the soul and its evolution. So, I'm going to support my discussion here with two different frameworks that I find complement each other and have been really instrumental in my own development and understanding. So, those two frameworks are evolutionary astrology, taught by Jeffrey Wolf Green, and anthroposophy, theosophy, taught by Rudolf Steiner. So, that's more of the spiritual science aspect of the understanding here. So the soul is the bridge between spirit and body. In anthroposophy, we have this system that looks at the structure of the human and takes into account the spiritual components of life. Okay, so I'll simplify this because it's much more complex than this, but simply put, we have a spirit, the soul, that directly gets its information from spirit and relays it to the body. Okay, so that is the soul is the bridge between the higher realms and the physical realms. So it incarnates again and again, carrying emotional imprints and desires, unfinished business from previous lifetimes in order to attain eventually sovereignty, freedom, and resolution from these imprints and separating desires. We'll get into that in a little bit. So let's try to define the soul, okay, which is often looked at as a very esoteric or undefinable concept, right, in the materialistic viewpoint. So to try to understand the soul with our intellectual capacities, we have to be open to widening our scope of understanding and to really come into a sense that there is much more to life than physical materiality. Okay, there are spiritual realms, there are spiritual beings that interact with us. Okay, so we have to be able to open up our minds to this and truly remember what we are. Okay, so in EA, we talk about the soul as the evolving consciousness that reincarnates to resolve desires and karmic patterns. And like I previously mentioned, Steiner sees the soul as the intermediary between spirit, so the eternal I, the higher ego, and the body. And it unfolds through stages of consciousness. And in EA, we also talk about the different stages of consciousness. So let's get into the impulse of desire and relate it to the soul. So in evolutionary astrology, we look at Pluto as the deepest desires of the soul, the bottom line, this undercurrent that really is like a baseline for our life and carries a lot of the symbolism that looks at the emotional imprints and the kind of like baggage that we carry into this lifetime from previous lifetimes. So the fundamental principle here is that every soul's evolution is driven by desire. In EA, we look at two main desires. So there's the first desire to separate from source, from God, and to experience individuality, diversity, and multiplicity, and to really look at the physical world as the source of, or as the kind of playing field for our evolution, okay? So that's the separating desire. There's a desire to separate from God, okay? And so the second desire is the desire to return and to merge with God. And I would say that the underlying main desire of the soul is to return to God. Okay, and this happens over like thousands of lifetimes sometimes, it's like, this is not, if we're born here, if the soul chose to incarnate, it means that there are things that are unresolved or that it came here to help others resolve things. There's a need to achieve something, okay, to assist in the collective or individual, the individual evolution does affect the collective. So there's a need to help evolve, okay? So for more evolved souls, oftentimes they'll come in to help evolve humanity, okay? So these are like great masters, teachers. But for the most of us, we're here to really resolve a lot of things and imprints that feel like a separation from God. Okay. So the ultimate desire is to return, to merge with God, to reunite with wholeness, with love and unity. So these two currents are always operating within the soul in different proportions and across lifetimes. So let's talk a little bit more about the desire to separate. So it's expressed through incarnation, lower impulses, lower ego. So let's talk about the desire to separate a little more. So this desire to separate is expressed through our incarnation. Like we wouldn't be here, right? If there wasn't anything within us that needed to be completely purified so that we can become complete sovereign beings, free from karmic imprints and emotional imprints, so that we can be completely merged with God. Okay, so it's also expressed through lower ego impulses, karmic entanglements, and attachment. So Pluto in the chart shows where and how the soul clings to separation, but needs to be released in order to reunite with God. In anthroposophy, we look at the astral bodies, unpurified instincts, and desires. Okay, so the astral body, we have different sheaths, we have different bodies around the physical body. So this can also be looked at or called the aura. So in the astral body, it basically is essentially the emotional body. And in that body, you can kind of imagine it as like a cloud, okay, that is like around the physical body that also intermingles with the physical body. And it carries unpurified instincts and desires and emotional imprints and forces that bind us to repetition and karma and unconsciousness, okay? So the other desire is a desire to return to merge with God. And this is expressed through the longing for wholeness, love, sovereignty, freedom from these emotional entanglements and imprints, and ultimately spiritual awakening. Okay. So in the chart, this is symbolized by the Pluto polarity point and the North Node, where the soul is drawn toward integration and transcendence. So we use polarity a lot in EA because it's like two sides of the same coin and both sides complement each other. And in order to resolve a lot of the desires that come with Pluto, we look at ultimately what is the way towards that is looking at the North Node, which is the ego structure needed to be developed in this lifetime in order to resolve Pluto's separating desires, which lead to the Pluto polarity point. So in anthroposophy, we'll look at the I consciousness, okay, which is the higher ego that gradually transforms the astral body and it turns blind, unconscious desire into spiritual virtue. Okay, so this is like the alchemy that happens within the energy bodies and is brought up into the soul. So the I is the higher ego, the eternal individuality that carries through lifetimes. It's the divine spark that can transform desire into love. In EA, Pluto shows us where the small ego, okay, the lower ego clings to separation, while the I in anthroposophy calls us back to unity. Okay. So there's a tension between these two desires. The soul is literally stretched between these two impulses. On one hand, we have separation, okay, through various experiences, multiplicity, individuality. And just to give context to this, like separating desires on just a very base level is like, you know, when you really want something in this physical realm, like you really want this car because you think that getting this specific car will bring you joy and happiness and fulfillment. Like if you could just get this one thing, everything would just resolve itself. And then you get that thing and you still have this unresolved, unfulfilled void within yourself. And so you seek something else and something else. So these are all ways that we exhaust that separating desire that can really only be filled by a reunification with God. Okay, so this is like the existential void that cannot ever be fulfilled with anything from the physical world. So that's not to say that like you shouldn't want anything. Okay, it's ultimately not placing the main your main goal on material achievement. Okay, and keeping God and spiritual development and service to others, service to God ultimately as your main focus. Okay, so that is really the tension between these two desires. And in returning to God, we find meaning and unity and freedom because we're not continuously ruled by our separating desires. So this is the tension that creates evolution. And every life swings between the separation and return until integration is achieved. So Rudolf Steiner talks about the fall into matter and then the return through conscious spiritualization. And that is the ultimate goal of humanity. And that is the evolution of humanity, to spiritualize more and more. Okay, and right now, if you look at the current state of affairs in the world, the doesn't look like that's what's going on. Okay, that's a whole other conversation in and of itself. But that is the ultimate direction that humanity will go into. Okay, so in each life, the chart shows where the soul has been overly identified with separation. So this is shown by Pluto's placement in sign and the South Node, which symbolizes the developed ego structures in past incarnations that we come into this lifetime with, and where and how we are invited to move towards return to God is demonstrated by Pluto's polarity point, by house and sign, and the vehicle through which that happens, which is demonstrated by the North Node. Steiner talks about different exercises that we can practice in order to develop this choice and desire for return and re-emerging with God and spiritualization as we consciously work with karma, and so that we're not bound by it and continuously repeating these cycles across lifetimes. So the ultimate goal is to reconcile the two desires, okay? To fully experience individuality while consciously uniting with God. Okay, so individualization is not a bad thing. Okay, it's actually necessary to come into full self-sovereignty. Okay, because we have this human history of this tribalism, okay, of not being a sovereign individual, okay, by being ruled by group consciousness, which is ultimately what we're moving away from and coming into our self-sovereignty and uniting and spiritualizing, okay? So that's the paradox of the soul's journey, the freedom to choose unity out of love, okay, but still holding sovereignty. So this is the ultimate future of humanity according to spiritual science, and the I becoming a free spiritual being who loves out of choice but not out of compulsion, okay, and not out of selfishness. So although we incarnate with these desires to separate, these separating desires that we believe will fulfill this existential void that we feel that can only really be filled by connection to God. Although we come into this incarnation with these desires, every one of those desires carries within it the seed of transformation. Okay, so it's like every time we feel that exterior pull, there's a medicine in that. It happens because of the need to become aware of it. Only by feeling that we are not fulfilled by those things can we return. And eventually, we don't feel those same desires anymore because we know that they're just not as fulfilling as connection and service to God is. So there's also the notion of karma here. So let's talk about that a little bit. In EA, we look at the South Node, which shows where the ego structure that the soul had developed in the past, and the North Node shows the new ego structure the soul needs to develop in order to get to the Pluto polarity point. So this is like karmic necessity and evolutionary intention. So we will attract experiences that kind of push us into that evolution. And if we resist, we attract these repeating types of experiences with the same baseline signature to them. So the soul is given the exact circumstances to transform itself. We choose the exact family, the exact culture, the time in which we're born. The soul orchestrates all of this with the help of higher beings, okay? But we are given the exact circumstances that we need for evolution, and sometimes they're really painful, right? Like life is not a fairy tale, okay? Evolution is not comfortable, but ultimately that's why we're here. So there are different stages of evolution. In EA, we look at three main ones that are broken down into 4 categories. We'll just go over the main ones. So the consensus stage, which is the first one, that about Jeffrey Wolf Green said that about 70%, I think, of people are in that stage. So living unconsciously and bound by mass consciousness and desire, okay? And then we move into individuated stage, which is an awakening of individuality, starting to question authority, questioning why does society work like this, and developing individual thinking for yourself. And then we move forward into spiritual stages where conscious participation in spirit and developing freedom and unification with God happens. Okay, so Steiner talks about the sentient soul, the intellectual soul, the consciousness soul. So these are kind of like a triad that we all have. It's not so much that like we move from one to the other in anthroposophy, is that one will kind of dominate the other. Okay, so they're all present. It's just that kind of our center, our gravity point kind of shifts from one to the other. So in each incarnation, we are offered opportunities to strengthen the I, okay, the higher ego, through tests of will and our thoughts, equanimity, okay, and our capacity for love, for forgiveness. And in astrology, we can look at transits, okay? We can look at progressions to kind of see the evolution in real time of the soul and what kind of experiences are currently being brought forward in order to catalyze evolution. So in astrology, we are pointed to looking at the unresolved karma and the future growth of the soul. And in anthroposophy, we are given practical exercises to consciously transform desires into virtues. Okay, so we'll look at these few exercises. So first we have control of thought. Okay, so that loosens karmic compulsions to become really aware of what thoughts are coming into your mind and to master those thoughts. Okay, so we have to cultivate kind of an inner quiet, okay, through meditation, through this inner stillness, so that when something comes into our mind, we're not compulsively attached to that thought and then letting it kind of grow and take hold of our consciousness. Okay, so the control of thought, control of will. This aligns with our evolutionary intention. Okay, so aligning our will with God's will is the ultimate desire. Where are we acting out of selfishness? Where are we acting out of separation? We need to look at control of will. Equanimity. So this stabilizes the emotional intensity. Okay, so just balancing the emotional field. Okay, to be kind of not completely swayed by our emotions. Okay, to let things wash over us as a wave, and to have practices like journaling or voicing out our emotions really stabilizes the astral body and the emotional body. Okay, it needs to be, things need to be expressed and moved through, okay, emotionally. Positivity. This balances the evolutionary crisis. And I know it's like, I'm the first person to say, like, it's really difficult sometimes to look at the positive side. And I've had a lot of resistance with this particular issue because I'm not somebody who will, I don't want to spiritually bypass. Okay. I'm not a person who's like, oh, like love and light and like just be loving all the time. It's like, it's so much more layered and nuanced than that. Okay. Sometimes neutrality is even more powerful than, or sometimes neutrality is like a bridge between that for me. Okay. But for me, I look at positivity as like, okay, if you go through a really hard time, like you're in crisis in your life, there's always a lesson behind that. There's always something that you can look at in that experience that you can take with you, even if it's just this tiniest thing, or this shift in perspective, that you can pull out some positivity from the crisis. Okay, so that is important to cultivate, and the more you cultivate it, the easier it gets, or the lighter the crisis feels. Okay, so that's an important one. Open-mindedness. This keeps the soul fluid and receptive. So we want to not get so bogged down by like our perspective and our way of seeing something and not allowing a different perspective on things. Okay, so open-mindedness, balance and harmony. This helps our integration. Okay, so instead of always being swayed into these different polarities, okay, these separations, the separating ways of seeing the world, okay, this me versus you, all of that, we want to come into a more balanced, nuanced, harmonized way of being within ourselves, ultimately cultivating stillness, okay? So balancing these practices kind of with your experiences that will be seen in your chart helps with this conscious co-creation of your soul's evolution. So the goal here, the soul's path is not only about resolving karma, but it's about becoming a sovereign, loving co-creator with the cosmos through attunement to God's will. Ultimately, proper attunement to God's will is the most sovereign way of living. Okay, and it's in co-creation. I mean, really doing God's will. Okay, to me, that is co-creation. It's not like this manifestation stuff or any of that. It's really, I am making manifest God's will, okay, in my life. So evolution leads back to God ultimately, and it leads to the dissolution of separating desires. And through that, we awaken to our spiritual destiny, individually and collectively. So we're not trapped in fate, okay? We do have these, before we incarnate, we do have these kinds of threads, okay, that are orchestrated that we come into this lifetime with, but we're not bound. There are certain events that are karmic, okay, in nature, but we are not trapped in fate. We have free will, and we are guided by meaningful necessity. Okay. So there's this difference kind of between karmic necessity and evolutionary necessity. Not every difficult thing that happens in your life is a punishment. Okay, I see that a lot in spiritual community that, if I'm going through this now, it must have been because I was this terrible, I must have done that in my past life. It's not always like that. It's more nuanced than that. So astrology gives us the cosmic imprint of our soul's intention, and spiritual practice gives us the tools to meet them consciously. So we can know our chart, but it's like it really comes alive through our living experience. And then how we meet these experiences is really our way of evolving. Like we can choose to meet experience super unconsciously, and that usually leads to repeating these patterns, or we can choose to meet everything with a conscious mind and a conscious practice. So I think that these two frameworks, anthroposophy and evolutionary astrology, really mesh well with each other because we have the spiritual science kind of practical guidance, and we have with astrology this kind of really like individualized imprint of the soul in the natal chart that really acts like as a map and as a guiding tool that never, like, it's not you look at your chart once and then like that's it. I've been practicing astrology for 20 years now, okay, and it's like whenever I go through something, I can see it in my chart and it comes alive in a different way, and it's a constant evolution through the chart, which is why I love astrology so much, and particularly evolutionary astrology, because we see the soul very clearly. And how I knew that evolutionary astrology was the absolute, for me, it was just blew my mind away after studying different, more, you could say like commercial types of astrology, was that I had an Akashic reading with a very, very talented psychic. And she basically, without knowing anything about me on our first meeting, without knowing my chart, seeing my chart at all, she gave me um, specific soul imprints that I first of all felt within myself and saw in my chart, and confirmed every single thing I saw in my chart for me through evolutionary astrology. So to me, that was the end point in terms of like looking for meaning in different types of lineages. So personally, that's my journey with it, and it has been absolutely incredible in mapping out the journey of my soul, and eventually um, leads me to sharing this type of work.